So hi and welcome to Solutions Journalism for the Black Press. I'm Janelle Johnson, Western Region Manager for Solutions Journalism Network. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today to discuss the power and importance of the Black press and how solutions journalism elevates our work. So I first want to start off by telling you a little bit about Solutions Journalism Network. So our mission is to transform journalism so that all people have access to news that helps them envision and build a more equitable and sustainable world. And we do this in a number of ways. So we work with newsrooms of all sizes across all platforms in the US and around the world. We offer specialized solutions-focused trainings for journalists in newsrooms. We also offer reporting grants and ongoing guidance in integrating solutions journalism into your storytelling, and we'll talk a little bit about that today as well. We offer a wide range of resources for journalism professors interested in introducing solutions journalism to their students. This includes a syllabus, in-class exercises, and homework assignments because we want to get solutions journalism in from the ground up. We also have a wealth of online resources on our website, including toolkits that can help you craft solutions coverage about health, education, violence, and economic mobility. We also have a guide for editors and for journalists interested in starting collaboratives. So let's get into why we're here today. All right. So we're talking about the Black press, and what we mean by the Black press are outlets published by and for Black people, specifically African Americans. This also includes Black journalists, editors, videographers, and other newsmakers who may work for majority white institutions or those who work for themselves. We're a collective here. The Black press has been a voice for the people for hundreds of years. We are not new to this. We are true to this, okay? African American, to quote a piece that I saw when I was preparing this presentation, African American journalism has played a dual role, serving as purveyors of news and information and as agents of social change. We can reflect on the contributions of people like Ida B. Wells and Frederick Douglass, who were not only writers, but also civil rights advocates. We can look to trailblazers like Ethel Payne, John H. Johnson, and Melba Tolliver, who ushered in a new era of what it means to be a Black journalist and entrepreneur. These lights have guided the work of the Black press today, which we can see in new Black-owned and Black-led publications like the Flint Beat, Black Light, and Capital B. I love to hear what comes to mind for you when you think about the Black press, so please drop your thoughts into the chat. So let's talk a little bit about solutions journalism. Solutions journalism may be a new concept to some. It may be something that you're already implementing in your work. It could also be something that you've been doing for a while and just did not know that there was a name for it. So what do we mean by solutions journalism? Solutions journalism is rigorous, evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. So we're not just looking at the problem or the issue at hand, we're looking at ways in which communities, organizations, city officials are actually working to solve that problem right where they live. So in order for a story to be a solutions journalism story, it must include four pillars. So a solutions journalism story is not just about a person doing something in their community. It's about a response to a problem and how it happened. It's more so about a systemic change, not just an individual effort. It also provides available evidence of results looking at effectiveness. It's not just about intentions, it's not just a plan of action, it's something that's actually happening now. It also seeks to provide insights that can help others respond to. And so it's not just inspiration, but what can people actually learn from this and take away and try to apply in their own communities? And because there are no perfect solutions, we must also consider the limitations. Where does this solution fall short? Who doesn't it help? What are the issues that are involved in making this solution a real, just like home run and perfect? So, just to think about it a little bit more visually, when you're thinking about your solution story or making a story or trying to figure out if a story has a solution journalism angle, here's a helpful way to approach that. The response, how it works, go ahead and jot it down. What are the insights? What evidence do you have? And what are the limitations? So we'll talk a little bit about how some Black outlets are using solutions journalism in their work. One of our panelists today, Aaricka Washington, put together this piece for Capital B. What happened after LA schools cut police funding and police funds and hired mental health staff for Black students? So a group of Black students pushed to defund school police, and they wanted those funds diverted to mental health, those funds diverted for mental health. This led the LA School Board to approve a $25 million cut in the school police budget, and they shifted those funds to a $36.5 million initiative called the Black Student Achievement Plan. And we're going to hear more about this story from Aaricka, who can break down those four pillars a little bit more for us. We also have another story, or a couple of stories, from New Amsterdam News, who did a three-part series. Next slide, please. Who did a three-part series about the creation of qualified immunity and how an act meant to protect people from experiencing an abuse of power led to exactly that. So we'll also hear from Damaso today, who can tell us more about this story. So a few things to keep in mind, or a few tips that I want to give you all when you're thinking about making your stories solutions focused. You want to identify the issue or question of concern as precisely as possible. You want to ask what's missing from the public conversation, and you want to start looking for candidates for solution stories by asking who's doing it better. And a lot of times that means going back to sources you already have to ask that question. So here are some key questions to ask. And each of these questions go back to those four pillars. So of course, the who's doing it better question, that's always going to be the question at hand, but also how does the response work? What metrics matter? That points to evidence. Who is the response not working for? That points to limitations. What does the research say? What do critics say? Both of those can lead to that insight box, right? Is it being replicated elsewhere? And what are the barriers to replication? So again, that last question goes to limitations. And you all may also be wondering, where can you find solution stories? Well, you can find solution stories where you find all of your other stories. We believe in solutions journalism, but we also understand that not every story is going to lend itself to solutions journalism, and that's completely fine. There's enough room for every sort of storytelling in the crowd. So you can look at qualitative and quantitative evidence, academic and public sector experts. You can go back to your past stories and sources. There may be an opportunity to refresh that story. You may have more information. Maybe something new has happened since you reported on it. You can look at networks of innovators. You can also check out our solution story tracker, which I'll show you later on in this presentation as well. And there's always a wealth of information in large data sets that you can always also look to as a guide. So simply put, solutions journalism is just good journalism. It makes journalism stronger, it strengthens accountability, and it investigates problems right in front of us. And it's also been proven that audiences like and appreciate solutions journalism. They find it to be more insightful, more hopeful. They're actually more likely to share solutions journalism stories with their peers. And that's a good thing, especially for the news business. So, as I mentioned earlier, today we have our solution story tracker. This is a curated database of thousands of stories from thousands of journalists and news outlets from all around the world. All you have to do is log on, the link is there. And let's say you're looking for stories about racial equity. You can search those stories. And dozens will appear. If you're working on a story about climate change, you can type that in. If you're looking for a solution story from a particular journalist, you can type their name in and you can search that and you can look at how other people are approaching their solution journalism stories and what topics and what trends are out there. And these may be things that may lead you to solutions in your own neighborhood. We also have other resources that we offer as Solutions Journalism Network. So we have a wealth, okay, a wealth of resources, okay. So you could work with someone like myself, who's the Western Region Manager. We have regional managers all across the country, all across the world, actually. So for instance, myself, I cover newsrooms in California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, and Hawaii. If you're in one of those newsrooms, I'd love to connect with you. Let's talk about how you can implement solutions journalism into your work. We also offer newsroom training. So if you're interested in getting your newsroom trained, we got you. We even do this for TV stations as well. And we'll hear from one of our panelists from Gray Television, who's one of those people who's implementing solutions journalism company-wide. And we also have toolkits because, we do live in a digital world and hey, they're self-guided. They are self-guided toolkits that you can do on your own. We have a basic toolkit. And again, we have toolkits that cover beats such as education, violence, and health. We also have new guides coming along, again, for investigative journalism, for editors as well. And they come in a bunch of different languages, Spanish, French, Chinese, Arabic, Russian. They're all there for you to consume. So without further ado, I would like for us to meet our panelists for today's discussion. So first we have James Finch of Gray TV. And we also have Aaricka Washington, who's a freelance journalist for hire, wink, wink. And we also have Damaso Reyes from New Amsterdam News. I'm sorry, I left that off. So I'll give them the opportunity to introduce themselves. We'll start with James and go to Aaricka and then Damaso.
Hey everyone, James Finch here from Gray TV. As you can see, maybe a little bit more gray in the beard than in that picture. So welcome from Gray. Thanks for being here. I'm Director of News Services for Gray, which means that I work on a lot of large scale contracts for the company. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but also work on some training, a little bit of recruiting for the company. Prior to being Director of News Services for Gray, I was with Raycom and I served as a regional news director under Raycom Media, which means that I work with about 12 to 15 markets as an internal consultant. And prior to that, I was a news director at the station level. And prior to that, an assistant news director, an executive producer, photographer. So a lot of varied experiences on the broadcast side of our business.
All right, thank you, James. Aaricka?
Good morning, everyone, or it's morning where I am. Well, I think everybody's on the West Coast. Yes. So good morning. I'm a freelance journalist based in LA. I write impactful stories about students and the issues they face in the US, in America. Previously, I've written for the New York Times, Time Magazine, PBS NewsHour, Business Insider, a lot of different places. I used to work for Chalkbeat and the Austin American Statesman as a K-12 education reporter. So I've had that experience too. And in my past life, I was a teacher. I did the Teach for America program in Houston, Texas. So I'm very passionate about, as you can see, very passionate about finding solutions for students. So that's what led me to this kind of work.
And Damaso.
Hi, my name is Damaso Reyes. I'm the investigative editor at the Amsterdam News and the founding editor of our new investigative unit called The Blacklight. Before that, I was a freelance journalist for about 25 years, reporting all over the United States and all over the world, including places like Indonesia, Rwanda, throughout Europe. And I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm so glad that we are all here today to have this conversation. So I think I'll start off with the first question. So how did each of you learn about solutions journalism?
I guess I can start. So Gray Television, we were involved with solutions journalism about 3 years ago. We had planned to do a project where we would bring SJN training to multiple markets and allow stations within that footprint to join together for that training. But then the pandemic hit. And then thereafter, we entered into a project called Bridging the Great Health Divide. And so that project was about health disparities in Appalachia and in the Mississippi Delta region of the United States. We felt like we did not want to have our coverage just focus in on problems. So with a thought about the SJN program and the training that it offered, we brought that training online to about 30 of our television markets in Appalachia and the Delta. We went through multiple weeks of training again online during the pandemic and had some favorable results from that. So that was our intro into SJN.
And James, I would just like to add a follow-up question to that. Why did you think it was important to introduce solutions journalism into your company?
So it was based on some evidence. Actually, I know evidence is a pillar of SJN, but the evidence was that, so we do research, we do audience research. SJN and Gray share a research vendor, and that particular vendor had done some research for SJN, which was shared with us, that showed that audience members meaning folks who watch the news or read the news, are worn out on journalists who just focus on problems. They don't want you to ignore problems, so they're not just looking for, as the previous slide said, puff pieces, but they want a rigorous investigation of potential solutions to systemic problems. And so based on the research, and we tend to follow research, so if the audience wants something, then we want to provide that thing that the audience wants, hopefully for the right reasons, like because it's morally and ethically good, but also because, we want ratings. And so since the audience wants solution-oriented reporting, we felt it was important to learn about it and then bring it into the organization.
Aaricka or Damaso, would either of you like to go next in talking about how you learned the solutions journalism?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So as a former freelance journalist, I spend a lot of time searching for grants and fellowships to support the kind of work that I wanted to do, which was often long form and investigative work. So solutions journalism popped up on my radar a couple of years ago, just as a potential funding source. But I didn't ever quite have a story that I felt like fit or that was appropriate for applying for a grant until last year or the year before last when I was working on this series with another writer. So we were very much interested and focused not just on talking about the history of this legal principle, but talking about the impact. And for us, what was really interesting is that solutions journalism or applying for a solutions journalism grant really helped us to focus our reporting on looking at what people were saying about reform and abolition of qualified immunity. And it just so happened while we were doing our reporting, a bunch of legislation was either being considered or actually being passed. So it was a wonderful opportunity to help us to focus in a way that we might not have focused on before.
Thank you. And the story is really good. Everyone who's on today, I'm going to send you links to the stories that we talk about today. That was a really good one. Aaricka?
Yeah, so I kind of just fell into solutions journalism. I know we talked about that before. But yeah, so I've been I'll get into this a little bit more later, but like with my latest story that I did for Capital B, I was happened to read some stories about this plan specifically for Black students. And I was like, that's an interesting solution to all the inequities that Black students face in school, hiring more counselors and specifically for Black students. A lot of times we see, this blanket cover of just a program be for everyone in a school. So and I was interested in seeking more information about that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But yeah, I tend to find these cool programs or seemingly interesting programs that are trying to solve a problem with a specific marginalized group and try to get more answers from that. And it's interesting because you always find limitations, right? Like you always find, that people have barriers to really achieving their success. But yeah.
Let me come off mute. Aaricka, I just want to stick with you for just one moment since we're talking about your story with capital B. But you have a background in education. So I would love for you to just talk a little bit about how your background as a teacher has informed your approach to storytelling, specifically education reporting.
Yes, absolutely. So I always tell people I had a really wild experience in Teach for America. I'm not sure who's all familiar with the program, but basically it's a very pie in the sky, we're going to make a difference, kind of white savior complex kind of organization. And so everybody there is like a high achiever and everything and wants to solve problems. So I think I came in with that mindset going into teaching. And when I started teaching in Houston, Texas, in low income Title I schools, I realized that was very hard to do, to make sure that every student was going to get an excellent education, because the schools that I was in were have very few resources and very little support. If anybody watches Abbott Elementary, that was like my school experience to the T.
Spot on.
like for real, like just a quick little thing. There was the school I was at, 2 TFAers actually left back to back in the same classroom, and the custodian ended up teaching that class. So just like Abbott Elementary. So that's my show too, girl. And so I say all that to say that I had all these hopes and dreams, right? That I was going to solve these issues. And then it just became a lot harder. And so I guess like being a teacher and realizing how hard it was to teach, realizing all the inequities that students face, I taught Black, Latino, and Southeast Asian students that were actually refugees.
Mhm.
And it just turned my world upside down. And I realized that there's so much that people need to know about what's going on in these schools. So that led me into journalism. I majored in journalism in undergrad, so I had that background. But I spent 3 years teaching and said, okay, I want to be an investigative reporter, actually. Which there are some ties between investigative and solutions journalism if you do
Right.
it well. And so, yeah,
That's what
I wanted to report.
happened.
Yeah, I wanted to report on the issues that I saw and the solutions that were sprouting up too.
I think that Aaricka is a great example of how journalists, Black journalists, I think specifically, because we haven't always gotten the best rap right in the news, and which has long-term effects, even now and even still in the future it will, right? But I think that a lot of times when we approach stories, we're naturally looking for solutions. We're naturally asking, well, what's being done about this? What are they doing? And so I have to bust you out a little bit. So I say Aaricka is a great example because Aaricka didn't know that she was doing solutions journalism. She was doing the work. A lot of us, we do the work, but we don't necessarily know that, this is an actual thing. So I think that that's great that that we do that we are naturally curious people looking for solutions, and that in turn continues on the work of those who have come before us. Angelica's in the chat saying that Abbott Elementary, that's her show. So so I love that. Damaso, I want to kick it to you for a second because Aaricka brought up a point about how solutions journalism, can be investigative journalism. And you are now over Blacklight. So can you tell us a little bit about Blacklight and tell us a little bit more, tell us more about the solutions journalism story that you all produce on qualified immunity.
Sure. So, I got my start with the Black Press, actually, with the Amsterdam News, where I'm now an editor, way back in high school. So for me, being a member of the Black Press has really been a formative experience. It's also allowed me to oftentimes do the kind of work I can't do anywhere else. I've always been interested in telling sort of underreported stories. That's what I've focused my career on. And I worked with another longtime contributor to the Amsterdam News, Herb Boyd, who had this idea. This was something that he had been sort of tracking for a long time, this idea of qualified immunity. For those of you who don't know what qualified immunity is, it's basically a legal doctrine that the Supreme Court invented to protect government officials essentially from being sued when, in the course of doing their jobs, they violate your constitutional rights. Now, Congress actually, way back during Reconstruction, passed a law saying that you could do exactly that. If a government official violated your constitutional rights, you had the ability to sue them directly. Qualified immunity essentially says, and it's most sort of famously used by police officers, says that, well, unless it's super egregious or unless another court has previously ruled that the way in which your rights were violated is a violation, then you can't sue. So basically, whoever's violating your rights has to know ahead of time that the way in which they're violating your rights violates your rights. I know it sounds crazy, but this developed over the past 50, 60 years into something which largely shields, especially police officers, from accountability. And so we decided we wanted to take a really deep dive, explore the roots of this legal doctrine, and then explore what's happening around it. Because remember, this was sort of in the aftermath of George Floyd. State and local legislatures were actually kind of moving to dismantle this because it was often used quite egregiously by police officers who, it was very clear they had violated somebody's rights, but because of this very, very high threshold that the Supreme Court has instituted, they couldn't be personally held responsible in a civil case. So we really wanted to sort of dig deep, and that meant taking a couple of months to work on this project. And so we looked around for funding, and Solutions Journalism Network was one of the places we applied for funding, and we were fortunate enough to get it. But it gave us the time and the freedom. And I think that as journalists, that's often what we don't have, is the time to really dig in on a complex issue. I'm not a lawyer. My colleague Herb's not a lawyer. We had to talk to a lot of people. I mean, I think I did certainly over a dozen interviews, probably closer to 20, just to really understand this issue and really explore it. And from my perspective, what's really great about getting a solutions journalism grant, as I said earlier, it really pushed us to actually seek out and find the people who were offering solutions, the legislators, the civil rights activists who were actually very actively promoting, and in some cases passing legislation to repeal or abolish qualified immunity. And without that sort of prompt, without that encouragement from the grant, we may not have sort of been, I think, as active in actually trying to track down the answers and the solutions, which were actually right under the surface. So I think for me, it's really, and with the creation of our new investigative unit, it's prompted me to really try to, even without the motivation of a grant attached to it, to really try to incorporate this into the work that we do. And as Janelle said earlier, I think one of the interesting things that I've reflected on is that oftentimes in the course of my previous reporting, I do come across people who are like, yeah, this thing is messed up and here's how we should fix it, right? Like if you talk to experts in law or medicine or public health, they often actually have proposals, they have solutions. And I think it's important for us to highlight those, because oftentimes that is what helps those potential solutions bubble to the attention of potential funders, to legislators, to executives who can then no longer claim, ignorance. I think the biggest challenge that a lot of people face when it comes to enacting change is inertia, right? They say, well, this thing is intractable. It's been a problem for so long, we'll never be able to solve it. Meanwhile, the people who are actually on the ground dealing with the problem, if you put them in charge, they'd be like, look, we do these 5 things in 5 years and we can figure it out, right? But they don't have the megaphone. They don't have the ability to reach the people in power. And that's one of the roles that journalists, including investigative journalists, can play, is to be a bridge between the experts and the member of the community who are being impacted and trying to solve problems with the people who have the resources to help them solve those problems.
Thank you so much, Damaso. While we have you here, because you mentioned the grant that you received from Solutions Journalism Network, I would love if you could talk a little bit about what that process was like, applying. Our application process, we have updated. Now it's only a 2-question application. And then we interview you and find out more about your organization and what you want to do with the project. So I don't think it was a 2-question or when you guys applied. No, you sure you had no.
No.
So
But
we have
it wasn't that hard, to be quite honest. For me, a good application process, of which I think solutions journalism was, and it sounds like it's gotten even more streamlined, is not at all, it shouldn't be very different from pitching your editor, right? You have to define what the problem is, right? So you have to do your homework, right? You kind of have to outline, scope out, like, well, this is what I want to work on. This is how I see it sort of coming together. Is it, one big article? Is it a podcast? Is it something like that? And then dig in, like do a little bit of research beforehand, like actually show that you kind of know what you're talking about, even as you're saying, hey, give me money so that I can dig even deeper. And then, in the case of solutions journalism, we certainly were asked, like, hey, who's out there proposing solutions? And, we had some idea, but we also, mentioned that, hey, we need to dig deeper, and that's part of what our funding will do. And then, I had a great conversation with Mikhail, who's here on the call, who sort of quiz me on what solutions journalism is and how it applied to the work we're doing. But he was our program officer and was incredibly supportive. He would check in during the process. We kept them updated. We let them know when we published. So I felt like it was a great experience. It wasn't overly intrusive, but at the same time, I knew that I had a support system and I had, someone I could go to and ask for help or bounce ideas off of. Which I think is really important, especially if you're a younger journalist or you're exploring a topic area that you're not necessarily an expert in, or you're new to solutions journalism as a concept. For me, it was great to have a program officer who was accessible, who could really help me work through some of the process of how I'm going to integrate this kind of reporting into my work.
Thank you so much. Well, y'all heard it from Damaso. Apply for the grants when you see them. James, I want to come back to you because I would like for you to share how journalists at Gray Television use solutions journalism in their health coverage.
So after we did the training, we had a few stories that actually made the solutions tracker that Janelle showed you earlier. The solutions tracker being that database where stories that hit the 4 pillars are housed. They're evaluated, and then if they meet the 4 pillars, they can go on the solutions tracker. But again, I would say that we didn't want to just focus in on the problem. Now, there was some value to that because health disparities in underserved, under-resourced areas, like that problem needs to be exposed, right? So we weren't saying that in that particular situation that just exposing the problem wouldn't have been a good thing. More so, we're talking about perpetual problems that we report on in our daily coverage of news that never have a solution attached to them. Those were the things we were concerned about. So with bridging the great health divide, again, just reporting the problem sometimes would have been enough, but we wanted to make sure that we were following up to offer some hope to people in those areas, that there maybe are some things that we have discovered that are actually working. So just as our stories can make the solution tracker, we could have our folks to go into the solutions tracker to search according to the type of story that they were doing to see if we could find examples of sustainable solutions in other parts of the country that then they could include into their reporting as well. And then if stakeholders, I would say decision makers, could see those solutions, then that maybe those could be some things that could be implemented in those areas.
I would love if each of you could tell us, why do you, or better yet, how do you think focusing on solutions continues the legacy of the great journalists who have come before us and who paved the way? Whoever would like to start.
Well, I would say when you mentioned, just when you mentioned Ida B. Wells and the work that she did, obviously she's exposing a problem. The end hope is that she eliminates the problem, right? So I would say, and I've said this before, that there are a few people in society that want problems to persist. Okay, so when Aaricka said, it's kind of a pie in the sky type thing, as she was referring to going into underserved areas to teach, not to SJN. But I would just say, like, there is still hope that we can bring to the table as journalists. Like, we're hoping to make positive change. And I believe after going through the training and seeing it applied in our group, I believe that this is a good way to provide that hope. And it's evidence-based, which means that if you've got a tracker story, you've really shown how it is a sustainable solution to a systemic problem. And that's what people want. Few people, like, who could argue against that?
I totally agree. I mean, the start of the Black press, the start of Freedom's Journal was around a problem, right? Slavery. So, and I think a lot of the great work that the Black press has done, especially during the Civil Rights era, was highlighting problems. Ida B. Wells was highlighting the problem of lynching and proposing solutions to it, which America should enforce its laws, essentially. So we have a very rich tradition in our work, and in part because I hate to use the overused term mainstream press, but the white serving and white led press often ignores our communities. So that includes ignoring the problems of our communities, or something that from their perspective is not a problem, is a problem to us, but they don't know it because they ain't got no Black people on staff, or they haven't empowered the people they do to actually do the good reporting. So it becomes our mission and our job to highlight the ways in which power is being systematically used against our communities, and to say something about it, and to hopefully create change. I think that is one of the most important legacies of the Black press, and it's still what we do, I think, today. It's one of the reasons why at the Amsterdam News we wanted to create our own investigative unit, because talking about solutions journalism, journalists of color have a hard time getting investigative journalism jobs at large institutions, as we learned recently with the LA Times and the Washington Post, among others. So we need to create our own space in order to give opportunities to journalists of color. And that's an important part of solutions journalism. And I think it's an important legacy of the Black press as well.
Wow. So James and Damaso said it all. I'm just clapping. Yeah, that was on point, Josie. I feel like I remember I was reading about I think it was about the Tulsa massacre, and how the difference between how Black journalists reported it and like white journalists reported it. And in the news organizations, they focused on the white people that died, which was very few, as you guys know. And but the Black journalists, it's like they took that step, like somebody mentioned Ida B. Wells when it comes to anti-lynching efforts. But what I've noticed when I look at the past is Black journalists, we were actually doing the work. Like, we were actually doing the investigative, the real, telling a true story, while the mainstream white journalists, they were just they were masking things. There was a lot of lies, a lot of just not good and factual journalism. So I think, and that gives me so much, like, it makes me feel empowered when I know that my forefathers and foremothers in this field, they sought out justice without even being like advocates necessarily, but kind of like advocates, because it's, we're, I don't know, journalism is different for us than it is for white people, because we are disenfranchised, we are a oppressed group, and so it does become a sense of like advocacy. I know Wesley Lowery once wrote a New York Times op-ed about how objective journalism isn't actually objective. We're all subjective, right? Especially if you come from a marginalized group. Well, and even white journalists are. So I guess my point in saying that is like, I look up to them, and I see myself doing stories like this because nobody was following up about this Black Student Achievement Plan. And so I wanted to fill in the gap. And I've always been that kind of reporter that went to those community meetings. Sometimes I was the only reporter back when I was in Austin. Sometimes I was the only reporter going to those meetings that the Black and Latino community members showed up to, or my editor made sure I went to like all the meetings. And that makes a total difference because people learn how to trust you. There's so much distrust in marginalized groups, and for good reason too, like I mentioned before. But when they see you out there, I'll never forget my third day at the Austin American Statesman. I went to a community meeting, and there was like the Black people there, they were so shocked to see me and so shocked to know that I worked for the Statesman. And they were like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're here. Please stay. And so, and they said the work that you're going to do here is going to be so important for us because they haven't had, I mean, they, you know, they needed that. So we have a very important role in finding and in reporting on these communities and finding solutions. Who's doing the work?
Yeah, who's doing the work? Who's doing it better? Thank you all so much. Well, we have 10 minutes left, and so I want to make sure we leave room for questions from the audience. I hope you all have questions for our panelists or for myself or any of my colleagues who are on the line who would like to chime in. So if anyone has questions, please feel free to unmute, or if you want to put your question in the chat, we can just read it off if you feel more comfortable with that. Or if
Holly
you have a
has her
comment
hand
you'd like to
raised.
share. Yes, Holly.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Janelle, for hosting this. And thank you, Aaricka, James, and Damaso for being here. My question is for Aaricka. I read your story about the defunding the school police in LA. And I was wondering if you have looked at the follow-up from that. Like I read in the story that they were going to be releasing a report or something. And so I was wondering if you had any insights. I don't want you to like spill the story if you're working on it right now, but I'm curious if you have any insights from that.
That's a really good question. Because I did seek out to do a follow-up story. And so this is the tough thing about journalism, you guys. I think I really wanted to do that follow-up story, but unfortunately I didn't have the time or the resources to do this story. And I don't know if, you know, other news outlets do either. Because like I said, I think that this is something that people have to stay on top of. So the school board has met up again to talk about the updates on that that plan, but I haven't looked through it, to be honest. But there is a follow-up story there, so if anybody want to do it, then go ahead. And then also another part of this is that the students want more. They want to meet up with the new superintendent, and they want a complete defunding of the police. So yeah, there's a follow-up to the plan, and then the students want more too. I haven't read.
Any other questions or comments? Josie, I see that you have a comment in the chat. Would you like to talk about that, or you just wanted to share that in the chat?
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you so much. Today was really informative and inspiring. I've read the pieces in the Amsterdam News, so shout out to her, Boyd and Damaso. Really important work. No, I just want to learn more about citizen journalism and ways in which the things that are happening on the ground in the community where I am and where we want to cover. And by the way, we've only been around for 6 months. I'm learning more about what's possible, and because we're very much part of the grassroots organizing work in the state where we are. We're constantly engaged as activists and as observers of issues from the first CRB with civilian complaint power, to subpoena power for civilians. We are, we're looking at ways in which the electoral process to get average citizens engaged in the electoral running on the ballot, marginalizes those who are not part of the party system or the boss system, and the way in which this becomes voter intimidation, even in a very democratic state and a state that supports the ending of voter suppression and voter intimidation. So it's interesting to hear these stories, because as you're talking, I'm thinking about as an activist, the work that I'm engaged in and ways in which we can share those stories and affect change for us at the very local level. So thank you.
Thank you, Josie. And I'll have someone follow up with you as well so you can learn more.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions? I hope you guys have some questions or some comments, even if it's a thought you want to share.
Looks like Angelica has her hand raised.
Yes, Angelica.
Hi. So my question is part question, part comment, but it was something interesting that was said, as far as, just checking the tracker and, sometimes for journalists to see or decision makers in communities to see, hey, this is a similar problem, but here is a solution that was utilized, at point A and could work for B. I guess, that kind of got me thinking as far as the other end of that. So I'm going to give an example, and I'm just going to use a show since, we used Ava Elementary earlier. I was watching something that was very interesting to me is I was watching the Netflix show, Worst Roommate Ever. And the very first episode was in Sacramento, California, where I'm located. And it just, it discusses, this older lady, Dorothea, who had a boarding house and was essentially killing the residents to take their Social Security checks. In order for them to tell that story, of course, they had to touch on the homelessness crisis in California at the time, forever then, still ongoing now. And, and I think what really just struck me was hearing a lot of the things that the officials and people that they interviewed were touting as measures that were being taken to combat that are the same things that are still being mentioned now. And mind you, this story happened 34 years ago, the story in the Netflix documentary. So to my point, when we mentioned, hey, here's a solution, I guess I just know if any of you could just kind of talk about how sometimes how solutions journalism stories, when you're studying these solutions, can also kind of shed a light on, hey, in full transparency, if this is being touted as a solution, in reality, sometimes a lot of progress is not really being made because again, in that example, if no one is studying that or just, from a data perspective or actually here, even if it's anecdotal, this was supposed to, be this was supposed to alleviate this. However, the same conversation we had so many years ago, we're still having them now because, it was maybe not that effective. How often, does that happen where, solutions journalism stories and the practice of that helps to shed a light on, let's stop pretending this is a solution because we studied the supposed solution and nothing's getting solved.
Thank you for that question, Angelica. So if one of my colleagues would like to chime in as well, I think that what Angelica may be getting at is what we call an instructive failure. And I think that Damaso's first story kind of touched on that a little bit because it talked about, what was the name of the act? I wrote it down, the Civil Rights Act of 1871, and how it ended up not doing what it was supposed to do. It didn't give what it was supposed to have gave, in a sense, right? So I think that that's kind of what Angelica is touching on. Will one of my colleagues like to kind of chime in a little bit more and talk about instructive failures as part of solution journalism? Mikhail, take it away.
Hey, Janelle and Angelica, that's a great question. I like to, as Janelle said, I like to call those instructive failures, but quite frankly, there are multiple ways you could look at it, right? There are solutions that were working and it stopped working because something happened. There are solutions that never worked, but nobody really investigated the data to begin with to see if it was actually working. And then there are things that are just things that even activists say would work, but there was no data that would have worked in the first place, right? It addresses the issue, so people are behind it. But ourselves as journalists, our job as journalists is to go deeper and say, okay, yes, I know you're fighting for this process, but is this process actually getting us to where we want to go? Homelessness is a great example of that, right? Everybody's fighting for an outcome and a process, but it doesn't mean the process gets us to where we want to go. So as a solutions journalist or journalist doing solutions journalism, I love those stories because it pushes back on our own biases, our own biases that this will work because it's addressing a problem. And that's okay, that's fine, because I'm sure most of us or none of us wants more money, more government money going towards a failed program. Or even if there's a more nuanced reason why it didn't work, say a certain program worked in LA but did not work in New York City, the nuance of why it didn't work is important, as opposed to just saying this program never works anywhere, right? It's good to say, okay, these are the circumstances it works on, and these are the circumstances it may fail in, and this is why it works in place A and place B or place B. So anyway, to address your question, in doing solution journalism, yes, you have to ask those the questions of those responses, follow the data, follow the research, follow the evidence, qualitative or quantitative, and write about what you're seeing. And if it's working, if it's working, if it's not working, if it's not working. And if it used to work and stopped, say that. If it never worked, say that too. That's just an important part of the work we do overall. Sorry, back to you, Janelle. I hope
I
that
like
helped.
that. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. That was a great answer. And I think we have one more question for the panelists from Alec, who's one of my SJN colleagues. His question is, do you have any advice for SJN on how we could deepen our learnings from the solutions-focused historical legacy of the Black press? In addition to the 4 pillars, what other elements are needed to make solutions-oriented reporting even more equitable? So it's a 2-part question, but yeah, so first part, how could SJN deepen our learnings from solutions-focused historical legacy of the Black press?
Well, I think I want to tackle actually the second part of
Okay,
that
that's fine.
first. Hire Black folks, support the Black press, subscribe to follow Black journalists on Twitter, highlight their work. I mean, sometimes the low-hanging fruit is the tastiest. I remember back in 2016 when I moved back to New York after an extended period overseas. I applied for a couple dozen journalism jobs. I didn't get any. Nobody would hire me because I was a freelancer of color, even though I had all this experience and wanted to bring that experience into newsrooms. And almost every editor, almost every interview I had was with a white person. So support your journal. If you're in an institution, support journalists of color. If you're a freelancer or not in an institution, support journalists of color, support journalism of color, give it a higher profile. And then, if you have the means, actually go ahead, make a donation, go ahead and support folks who are out there doing this work. Just highlighting the great work that people are doing on social media is a great way to, I think, support journalism of color and solutions journalism in general.
Thank you, Damaso. James, Aaricka, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would agree. We often talk about the fact that, in television news, we have what's called designated market areas. And I won't go into that, but basically it's a geographical footprint of your coverage. Where does your signal go? And so we often talk about a need for our newsrooms to reflect the market dynamics, the demographics of the marketplace, to try to make that happen, both from a leadership standpoint and certainly to the journalists who are making decisions about coverage.
Very important work, especially as you say, from the top down. Aaricka, do you have any thoughts? And then we'll wrap it up.
All I was going to add was I'm a history nerd. I taught history. I believe in reading up on the work of journalists, Black journalists. I know I need to, and I want to, because a lot of the books that I read in Indiana University and Columbia about journalism, or a lot of the history that we were taught was very Eurocentric, very white. We weren't taught about the journalists of the past unless they were the ones that, you know, like what's his name, Jason Blair, you know, the ones that got in trouble, right? Not Ida B. Wells, not I believe the journalist's name is Marvel Cook. Okay, like we weren't learning about those Black women journalists,
Right.
Black men journalists that actually were doing important work. So I also suggest looking up Media 2070. They are an organization that is like trying to get Black communities to trust the media again. And they're telling like the story of mistrust, the history of mistrust when it comes to the media. And on their website, I tried to put the website in here, but for some reason it won't allow me to put the website. But if you Google Media 2070, their page should come up. And so they're really trying to figure out you know, solutions to media reparations. There it is, media reparations. I think they changed the website name. But yeah, so check that out. I think that will give you some insight on like the history of mistrust and how you could build trust with Black communities. And I don't know, I like looking at their site to get the history and then figure out how I can even deepen my reporting and solutions and investigative right now.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today to partake in this conversation. I just want to leave you all with this quote as we end the day. It's from Frederick Douglass. In the grand struggle for liberty and equality now waging, it is right and essential that there should arrive in our ranks authors and editors as well as orators, for it is in these capacities that the most permanent good can be rendered to our cause. So thank you all again for being here today. I appreciate all of our panelists for taking their time today to speak to us. And hopefully we can all do more gatherings like this around the Black press, because again, we are not new to this, we are true to this. Y'all have a good day. Thank you so much for attending.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was great.